Welcome back to the deep dive. For a long time now, we've been swimming in the waters of understanding prejudice, how it forms, how it persists, and how it quietly influences our decisions.
hmm
But defining the problem is really only half the battle. Today, we are tackling the crucial question that I think really matters. How do we move beyond theory and actively reduce prejudice and discrimination?
And that is absolutely our mission for this dive. We are drawing from Chapter 13 of a foundational text on the psychology of intergroup relations, which is, it's essentially a blueprint for intervention.
Okay.
We are going to dissect the psychological strategies that operate on, well, three essential levels: the individual's internal effort, the dynamics of interpersonal contact, and then the systemic frameworks that organizations and institutions put in place.
Right.
It's a really comprehensive look at what psychological science has actually tested and found to be effective, and just as importantly, where even the best intentions can sometimes, backfire.
I love that we are focusing on the how-to today because, look, knowing you have a bias and knowing how to fix it are two vastly different things.
Completely different.
So we're starting inward, right? We're going to examine the cognitive tools, the sort of mental wrestling match that an individual has to undertake to control their own biases before we zoom out to look at group dynamics and policy.
Precisely. Let's start with the person who honestly believes, I am not prejudiced. Because even for that person, the brain is still running shortcuts. And sometimes those shortcuts lead to behavior that contradicts their core values.
This is where the self-regulation model of prejudice control becomes so illuminating. It provides a cycle, a structured way to understand how even well-intentioned people can accidentally mess up, realize it, and then, implement preventative measures. How does this cycle even begin?
It begins with a breach. The individual acts in a way that is biased. Maybe they made an assumption or used an inappropriate term or avoided someone, and this action directly contradicts their cherished self-image as an egalitarian, non-prejudiced person.
And that breach creates what the research calls negative affect.
Right.
We should probably pause on that term, negative affect. It's a bit of a technical psychological term, but what does it actually feel like for someone?
That's a great question. It's more than just general sadness. In this specific context, it is the internal emotional consequence of a specific cognitive conflict. You might know it as cognitive dissonance.
Ah, right, the inner conflict.
You believe you are a good person A, but you just behaved like bad person B. That contradiction generates feelings of guilt, regret, shame, or even anxiety. And crucially, that negative emotion, it acts as the fuel. Without that painful feeling, there is just no motivation for change.
So the whole process hinges entirely on awareness. If you don't recognize the slip-up, the cycle just never starts. But once you feel that guilt, that forces the critical second step, reflection.
Exactly. The reflection is absolutely key. The person asks themselves, what caused me to act that way? And, how could I have behaved differently? They're analyzing the context, their mental state, the characteristics of the person they interacted with. This deep reflection is what allows them to develop cues.
Ah, so this is like an internal warning system. What exactly are these cues?
They are contextual or characteristic reminders. They're sort of developed internally to act as mental alarm bells. For instance, the person might realize, every time I am tired and interact with someone with X characteristic, I use Y shortcut.
I see.
The cues might be related to a specific outgroup stimulus, like a particular facial feature, an accent, or skin color that tends to activate an existing stereotype unintentionally.
So in the future, when that outgroup stimulus appears, the newly developed control cue fires off the warning. It's a proactive alert system that bypasses the need for the guilt cycle to restart every single time.
It's really the difference between slamming on the brakes after you've hit something versus seeing the stop sign way ahead and easing into the halt. The warning allows the person to inhibit the automatic prejudiced response and consciously select an appropriate non-prejudiced one.
That sounds exhausting, though. I mean, it sounds like an enormous amount of mental labor, always having to police your own thoughts in real time.
It is initially. It really is. But here's the good news. With enough practice, self-regulation can become automatic.
Really?
Yes. This isn't just wishful thinking. We see it in training programs. When people practice actively negating stereotypes, saying things like, not all engineers are socially awkward, or whatever the specific stereotype might be, it reduces the activation of that stereotype over time. They are, in a sense, cognitively training their mental muscle.
I do wonder about the efficiency of negation, though. If I tell myself, don't think about pink elephants, I immediately think about pink elephants. Is fighting the negative thought the most efficient route?
That's a brilliant point, and the research actually supports your intuition. While negation helps, the sources highlight that affirming counter stereotypes, so actively focusing on examples that disprove the bias, has an even larger effect on control.
Okay, can you explain the cognitive distinction there? Why is affirmation superior to negation?
So when you negate, you are still actively engaging with the stereotype itself. You are just slapping a mental NO sign on it. That requires a high cognitive load and, like you said, can backfire, the pink elephant problem.
Right.
When you affirm a counter stereotype, you are performing a totally different cognitive function. You're activating an entirely different positive association pathway. You are bringing to mind specific, detailed examples of outgroup members who defy the stereotype, say, recalling a highly successful, articulate politician who belongs to a stereotyped group. You are replacing the abstract, often negative shortcut with a concrete, positive, and complex reality.
So it's about shifting the focus from I must suppress this bad thought
Yeah.
to I must actively generate an accurate, positive alternative.
I
That internal training is so essential.
Absolutely. And once we move past self-monitoring our own automatic responses, we can adopt a more expansive cognitive tool, perspective taking.
Perspective taking. That empathetic leap, actively trying to imagine the world as someone else experiences it, the manipulation sounds almost like a writing exercise designed to force that imaginative effort.
It is deeply engaging. Researchers will prompt participants with instructions like, imagine a day in the life of this person, looking at the world through their eyes and walking in their shoes. This can involve writing a detailed essay about that imaginary day, reading vivid first-hand accounts of discrimination from members of the outgroup, or even structured face-to-face meetings where the goal is mutual sharing of experience.
And what does that active manipulation accomplish? What are the results?
Well, the effects are undeniably robust. It leads to significantly more positive attitudes, and it impacts both explicit measures, so what people consciously say they believe, and implicit evaluations, reducing those automatic underlying associations. Importantly, the research suggests these positive changes are often long-lasting. It's not a fleeting boost of empathy. It seems to actually restructure how you categorize and view that specific individual or group.
So in a way, it changes attitudes. But how does it work on a cognitive level? What's the mechanism making that change happen?
The mechanism is primarily about breaking down the wall between us and them. First, perspective takers begin to see a significant overlap between their own characteristics and experiences and those of the outgroup. They start to realize shared struggles, similar ambitions, and common humanity.
So you're realizing that the outgroup member is actually dealing with the same mortgage woes or career anxiety or parental struggle that you are.
Exactly that. And second, this process strengthens social bonds. When you feel a connection, you're motivated to engage further, which leads to rewarding relationships. We are hardwired to seek positive social outcomes, and perspective taking sort of primes us for those successful, enjoyable interactions.
This sounds incredibly useful for driving real-world change, not just attitude shifts. Does the research show behavioral outcomes?
It does, yeah. Studies consistently find that perspective takers are later more likely to help someone from the targeted group. They'll intervene when they see unfair treatment or offer assistance in a stressful situation. Furthermore, they place less social distance between themselves and that targeted group member, which indicates a greater willingness to integrate and form deeper ties.
That's powerful evidence. But, nothing in social psychology is without its caveats. Where does perspective taking fall short?
There are crucial limitations, and we have to acknowledge them for this to be an honest appraisal. First, the strategy can actually backfire for people who already identify very, very strongly with their in-group.
Why would attempting to understand the other side make them more prejudiced? That seems so counterintuitive.
For highly identified in-group members, the act of stepping into the out-group shoes can be perceived as an act of disloyalty or a threat to the distinctiveness of their own group.
Oh, I see.
They may feel cognitively uncomfortable or even morally conflicted, and rather than integrating the out-group's perspective, they double down on in-group superiority or distinctiveness to reduce that internal threat.
That makes sense. It's sort of a defense mechanism against identity erosion.
Another significant limitation is that the benefits are often group-specific. If you spend a week intensely taking the perspective of a member of Group A, your attitude toward Group A improves significantly. But that empathy and understanding rarely, if ever, spills over to Group B or Group C. It requires highly targeted, repeated effort.
So it's not a universal empathy switch, it's a specific relational tool.
Precisely. And there's an interesting contextual limitation related to anticipation. Perspective taking may be less effective if the in-group member knows an actual interaction is about to occur.
That seems strange. Shouldn't planning for the interaction make the empathy more effective?
You'd think so, but when an actual interaction is anticipated, the in-group member's focus can shift from how does this person feel to how am I coming across? They become anxious about self-presentation, worrying about saying the wrong thing, appearing prejudiced, or making a social blunder. And that anxiety just overrides the empathetic processing.
It sounds like the cognitive load shifts from external focus, which is empathy, to internal focus, which is self-monitoring, and that derails the whole goal.
That's a perfect summary. And one final nuance. The sources note that the benefits of perspective taking are more pronounced in Western cultures, largely due to something called relational mobility.
Okay, we need to unpack relational mobility. That is definitely high-level psychological jargon.
Relational mobility refers to the degree to which individuals have opportunities to form new relationships and dissolve old ones. In cultures with high relational mobility, like the US or other individualistic Western countries, people frequently move, change jobs, and form relationships based on personal choice. Because forming new ties is easier and more common, the effort you put into perspective taking is quickly reinforced by new, rewarding social connections. You're actively seeking new ties.
I see. So in cultures with low relational mobility, where social structures are more fixed, the opportunity to benefit from those new positive bonds, even if you successfully take someone's perspective, is lower. And that could reduce the motivation for the initial effort.
Exactly. The environment has to support the behavioral output of the cognitive shift. And that brings us perfectly to the next level of intervention, intergroup contact theory, which addresses the environment directly.
The moment we start talking about groups actually interacting, we land squarely on one of the most famous psychological concepts for social change. The contact hypothesis, developed by Gordon Allport in 1954. The simple idea is that contact reduces prejudice.
The idea is simple, yes, but the reality is complex. Allport was adamant that mere contact is not enough. Putting two hostile groups in the same room can actually increase hostility.
Right.
It is interaction under the proper conditions that leads to positive change. And he specified 4 essential conditions, which act as a kind of recipe for successful integration.
Okay, let's detail that recipe, starting with the baseline environment. Equal status.
This is fundamental. The groups have to have parity within the specific contact situation. If Group A and Group B meet, but Group B is clearly the janitorial staff, and Group A is the executive team, well, the contact situation will simply reinforce the existing societal hierarchy.
Great.
The in-group may feel justified in derogating the lower status out-group, and that just reinforces the prejudice.
It's critical to note that this is about status within the context setting, even if societal status is unequal. I'm thinking a school principal might engineer a project where students who usually hold high status are made dependent on the knowledge of a low-status group for success in that specific task.
Precisely. You're artificially creating an equal or even reversed status dynamic in that microenvironment. However, the general societal commitment to egalitarianism still matters greatly. It's just easier to maintain that equal status in a society that already prioritizes equality.
Condition 2 is cooperation. They can't just stand next to each other. They have to rely on each other to achieve a shared objective.
Cooperation is the essential engine of successful contact. When groups work cooperatively towards shared, common goals, they replace the us versus them dynamic with an us working together for a common purpose dynamic. Contact without cooperation is psychologically inert. It does nothing to improve attitudes.
This is beautifully illustrated by the research in sports psychology that the source highlights.
Absolutely. Think about team sports versus individual sports. In a basketball team, success depends on the cooperation and coordination of every single player, regardless of their background. Research shows that cooperative contact in team sports leads to significantly improved intergroup attitudes among the players.
And why is that?
Because the goal achievement, winning the game, is contingent upon mutual success.
Right. And if you contrast that with individual sports like track and field or swimming, you may train alongside diverse individuals, but your goal achievement is purely individual. That contact does not show the same positive effect on intergroup attitudes. The proximity is there, but the interdependence is missing.
Condition 3 is acquaintance potential. The contact has to provide the opportunity for members to get to know each other on a deeper, more personal level, not just as tokens of their group, but as unique individuals.
This moves beyond simple interaction and into the realm of true personal discovery, ideally leading to friendship.
And this is key. Intergroup friendships are perhaps the strongest predictor of lower prejudice. When you transition from a colleague to a friend, the psychological barriers drop dramatically. The research consistently shows that the quality of the friendship is far more important than the sheer quantity of fleeting superficial interactions.
So one deep friendship is better than a dozen acquaintances.
Far more powerful. A deep, meaningful relationship with one outgroup member is far more powerful than casual acquaintance with a dozen.
And finally, condition 4, institutional support. The whole environment has to signal that reduced prejudice is the expected and rewarded behavior.
This condition provides the necessary structure and legitimacy. Authorities, whether it's organizational management, community leaders, or military commanders, must actively establish expectations for lower prejudice and less discrimination. They need to create clear reward structures and sanctions for noncompliance.
And the psychological function of that support is fascinating, isn't it? It triggers cognitive dissonance.
It absolutely does. If the institution you respect mandates non-discriminatory behavior and you comply with that behavior but still hold negative private attitudes, your mind is in conflict. To reduce that uncomfortable conflict, that dissonance, it's often easier to shift your private attitude to align with your public, institutionally sanctioned behavior.
So the institution forces the positive behavior, and the mind follows by changing the attitude.
That's the idea.
So when all port's 4 conditions are successfully implemented, the research confirms the overall impact is a moderate to strong reduction in prejudice across diverse outgroups. What kind of psychological changes are produced?
It's pretty comprehensive. On the positive side, contact increases knowledge about the outgroup. It fosters genuine empathy, sparks interest in other cultures, and strengthens the individual's motivation to control their own prejudice, which ties back to the self-regulation model we discussed earlier.
And what negative effects does it successfully diminish?
It reduces stereotyping, decreases the perception of the outgroup as a threat, minimizes intergroup anxiety, and it lowers expectations that future interactions will be negative. Essentially, it transforms the entire interaction landscape from one of fear and uncertainty to one of possibility and comfort.
But we also have limiting factors here, particularly related to who is willing to engage in contact in the first place.
Yes. The process often fails to reach 2 key groups. First, people already high in prejudice are, well, masters of avoidance. They simply won't seek out or stay in contact situations, especially if they are voluntary. Second, people high in intergroup anxiety who may want to connect but are terrified of saying the wrong thing or being rejected. They lack the confidence to sustain the required positive relationships. Their fear of a negative outcome prevents them from risking interaction.
That anxiety leads us directly to the concept I find most, chilling in this entire body of research.
Yeah.
The positive versus negative contact asymmetry.
This is a critical psychological finding that has huge practical implications. While positive contact is beneficial, the sources are clear. The effects of negative contact may be more powerful and harmful than the effects of positive contact are beneficial.
So one negative interaction can actively undo the work of several positive ones. Why is the negative experience so much more impactful?
Human psychology is fundamentally wired for threat detection. Negative information, especially information that confirms pre-existing biases or arouses strong negative emotions like anger or contempt, is processed faster, remembered more vividly, and weighted more heavily in future judgments than positive information. So if the negative encounter is brief, emotionally charged, and confirms existing stereotypes, it becomes a powerful, self-reinforcing example of why the in-group should remain separate and wary.
It solidifies a pre-existing cognitive shortcut. I knew it was dangerous, or I knew they were hostile. This single point of negative data provides a strong emotional justification for retreating from future contact.
And it raises the stakes dramatically for any social integration program. You can create a school or a workplace with 3 positive interactions for every negative one. But if that single negative encounter is emotionally searing, it risks contaminating the entire environment.
Given the difficulty of guaranteeing all 4 conditions and mitigating the risk of powerful negative contact, researchers have looked at ways to reduce prejudice without requiring direct face-to-face interaction. This brings us to indirect strategies. Let's start with the extended contact effect.
This is one of the most remarkable findings. The extended contact effect states that simply having an in-group friend who, in turn, has out-group friends is sufficient to reduce your own prejudice toward that out-group. You are benefiting purely by proxy.
That is genuinely fascinating.
Yeah.
What mechanisms are at work here? How does that even work?
Three major things happen. First, it significantly reduces your intergroup anxiety. If your trusted friend has a good relationship with an outgroup member, you conclude that the outgroup member is safe and that interaction is possible and permissible.
Right?
Second, it creates cognitive dissonance for you. I like my friend, and my friend likes this outgroup member, yet I'm supposed to dislike the outgroup. That doesn't add up.
The logic forces a reevaluation.
Yes. And third, and most practical, it serves as a powerful model. It demonstrates not only that intergroup relationships are possible, but that the outgroup member is open to forming them. This is especially effective in segregated environments where face-to-face contact opportunities are scarce.
So it's a huge deal for people with high anxiety.
For marginalized communities or groups where anxiety is high, this indirect assurance can be just as effective as direct contact.
We also see an extension of this into media, which is how most people experience groups they don't personally interact with.
Exactly. Media contact seeing positive, nuanced, and realistic portrayals of outgroups in books, movies, or news functions as a powerful form of extended contact. We often form what are called parasocial relationships with fictional characters. When we see a positive, fully developed fictional character who is a member of an outgroup, we are essentially taking their perspective and experiencing their world, which reduces our threat perception.
And finally, there's the purely cognitive intervention. Imagine contact.
Imagine contact is self-directed mental rehearsal. You actively imagine or rehearse a positive, relaxed, and comfortable first meeting with an outgroup member.
It sounds a bit like self-help visualization, but I assume there's a real psychological mechanism driving this.
There absolutely is. The mechanism is rooted in anxiety reduction and self-regulation. By mentally rehearsing a positive scenario, you are developing a successful interaction script in advance. When the actual interaction occurs, you have a prepared blueprint for behavior, which reduces the ambiguity that often causes anxiety.
So instead of going into the interaction wondering, what do I say, how do I act? You have a preloaded script that feels comfortable and natural.
And the impact is measurable. Imagine contact reduces negative intergroup emotions, lowers physiological arousal like heart rate spikes in anticipation of contact, and fittingly, it increases perspective taking. While it may not replace the depth of face-to-face contact, it is an invaluable psychological warm-up tool, particularly for those high in intergroup anxiety.
We've now established that positive contact works, and it moves from individual attitude change to behavioral change. But the ultimate goal isn't just liking one person, it's changing how we categorize and view entire groups. The research outlines 3 stages of identity change that result from sustained contact.
These 3 processes represent a kind of sequential evolution in intergroup relations, moving from focused individual interaction to collective restructuring. The first is personalization.
This is the most immediate result of quality contact, right?
Yes. When you get to know someone as an individual, learning about their job, their kids, their hobbies, you start seeing them as a complex person with multiple unique social identities. The importance of their outgroup category lessons and group boundaries just fade in that moment.
The benefit is the reduction of stereotypes for that specific person. But what's the drawback of stopping at personalization?
The major drawback is a lack of generalization. Your increased liking and reduced prejudice apply only to that specific individual. You might think, she's great, but she's the exception. The group stereotype remains intact, and the prejudice toward the group as a whole does not significantly change.
So it's a necessary first step, but entirely insufficient for broad social change. That realization leads to the second, more ambitious stage, the salient categorization model. This is where the complexity truly ramps up, because you have to maintain a delicate cognitive balance.
This model requires a dual focus. Positive attitudes will generalize only if the outgroup member is seen as typical of their group, while simultaneously disconfirming the negative aspects of the group stereotype.
Wait, those 2 requirements seem to pull in opposite directions? You have to acknowledge they are a typical Group X member, but their behavior must defy the typical stereotype of Group X. How does the brain even manage that contradiction?
It requires a highly structured contact environment. If the outgroup member is seen as atypical, their positive qualities are dismissed as an exception. If they are seen as typical, their behavior might be ignored if it contradicts existing schemas.
So what's the sweet spot?
The ideal situation is one where the contact emphasizes each group's unique and positive strength. For example, a setting where a member of Group X performs incredibly well at a task, and this performance is explicitly linked to a positive cultural value of Group X, rather than dismissing the behavior as simply personal talent.
So the environment must facilitate the realization. This person is a true representative of Group X, and their positive, non-stereotypical behavior must therefore be a true characteristic of Group X.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize that the non-stereotypical behavior should not negatively impact the other group. This complex balance holding the category salient while simultaneously updating the category's content requires continued constructive contact, making it a more advanced outcome than simple personalization.
That leads to the final, most ambitious stage, common in-group identity. This is where the in-group and out-group decide to recategorize themselves into a single, unified group.
Think of a successful corporate merger, or two formerly rival high schools combining to form one unified institution. The boundaries dissolve, and everyone now shares a higher-order identity. This is tremendously effective at improving relations within that new, large group.
But the sources warn this model has significant drawbacks related to cultural dominance.
The drawbacks are serious and often lead to resistance. The most frequent issue is that the majority members, often unconsciously, tend to define the common group in terms of themselves.
Oh.
They might assume the minority group will adopt their norms, values, and language, effectively erasing the minority culture.
And the minority groups recognize this danger. Their resistance stems from the fear of having to give up their valued current identities, the cultural distinctiveness that provides meaning and historical connection.
This fear is especially pronounced for those minority members who strongly identify with their current groups. They view the common in-group identity model as basically assimilation in disguise. The psychological solution to this resistance is the concept of dual identity.
Which allows them to have their cake and eat it, too, so to speak.
Yes, in the best possible way. Dual identity allows groups to retain their current valued identities while simultaneously adopting a higher-order common identity. They remain distinct departments, but are unified by the overarching company brand.
Right.
They maintain their cultural heritage, but are united by the common national citizenship. This strategic balance, maintaining uniqueness while acknowledging shared goals, is critical for successful long-term integration.
We've moved from the individual's mind and the interpersonal handshake to the larger philosophical frameworks that institutions and governments use to guide their policies. We have to discuss diversity ideologies, and the first, most pervasive one is the colorblind perspective.
The colorblind ideology is rooted in a highly positive intention, promoting equality by urging people to ignore group membership entirely and focus only on commonalities. It sounds ideal on the surface, but the psychological effects reveal deep, unintended consequences.
The sources break this down into two very distinct aspects, and we have to treat them separately. Let's start with the dangerous side, color evasion.
Color evasion is the active avoidance of recognizing, discussing, or engaging with issues related to race or ethnicity. This sounds like "I don't see color," or "talking about racial issues just causes unnecessary tension." The underlying belief is that if we stop discussing difference, the difference will cease to matter.
But the research shows we cannot easily ignore basic categories. Our brain is automatically wired to categorize people within milliseconds. What are the consequences of trying to suppress this awareness?
Well, there are several problems. First, the human brain cannot simply ignore salient social data. Second, the suppression of these categories can lead to a rebound effect, where the suppressed thought becomes even more prominent later. And crucially, colored evasion is positively correlated with prejudice.
So people who actively try to be color evasive are often more biased. Why does this backfire so profoundly?
Because the avoidance approach desensitizes majority group members to the reality of racial bias. If you refuse to discuss race, you cannot perceive the systemic disadvantages faced by minority groups, which reduces your motivation to address inequality. Furthermore, the sources link color evasion directly to an increase in committing microaggressions because the evader believes they are operating in a neutral, post-racial space, even when their behavior is clearly biased.
It's the denial of reality that is the problem. Now let's pivot to the second aspect of the colorblind perspective, the part that is actually beneficial, the equality orientation.
The equality orientation is focused on the idea of procedural justice and individual merit, treating everyone the same regardless of background and viewing outgroup members as individuals. This translates to statements like, "Everyone should be treated the same," or "We should all strive for common ground."
The research on this side is much more positive, right?
Yes. While it's less studied than color evasion, the evidence we have shows that the equality orientation aspect is negatively correlated with prejudice. The desire for equal treatment and finding commonality is psychologically beneficial. It's the evasion of differences and the refusal to acknowledge inequality that is corrosive.
Moving on, the sources quickly dismiss the assimilationist perspective. What is that perspective and why is it problematic?
The assimilationist perspective argues that minority groups should abandon their distinct culture, norms, and values and adopt those of the majority culture. The intention is to eliminate intergroup differences, thereby eliminating prejudice.
But this is an ideology of cultural dominance.
Exactly. It implies a profound disrespect for the other culture, viewing it as a liability that must be discarded for social acceptance. Unsurprisingly, this perspective is positively correlated with prejudice and is deemed an unsuccessful, even harmful, framework for managing diversity.
That leaves us with the multicultural perspective. This is the framework that celebrates and respects group differences, arguing that prejudice stems from a lack of knowledge and respect for other cultures.
This framework has strong evidence supporting its efficacy. People who adopt a multicultural perspective score lower on both implicit and explicit measures of prejudice. It encourages learning, fosters respect for diverse identities, and addresses the historical invisibility of minority groups.
But even the celebrated multicultural approach has subtle shortcomings, making it imperfect on its own.
It does. By emphasizing group differences so strongly, it can sometimes be associated with stronger perceptions of boundaries, which can, paradoxically, reinforce stereotyping. If you only talk about differences, the potential for shared humanity can be overlooked.
And there are two more serious risks associated with its misuse, particularly by the majority group.
Yes. The first is that multiculturalism can be used as a legitimizing myth. People might acknowledge cultural differences, but then attribute observed group disparities, like lower economic outcomes or academic gaps, to supposed deficiencies in the minority culture, rather than systemic inequality.
So it shifts the blame from structural barriers to cultural flaws.
Right. And the second risk is using it for moral credentialing.
Explain that one.
That's when someone says, I am a strong supporter of multiculturalism, therefore I cannot possibly be biased. They use their public support for the ideology as a moral credential to dismiss or deflect any allegations of personal prejudice. The research shows people who do this are often more likely to commit microaggressions later because they feel they have already paid their dues.
So we have color evasion being toxic, assimilation being culturally dominant, and multiculturalism, while excellent, sometimes reinforcing boundaries or being misused. What is the optimized evidence-based strategy for managing diversity?
The research suggests a highly strategic combination, drawing on the strengths of the two non-destructive approaches. The strategy is threefold.
Step 1.
Start with the multicultural approach. This is crucial for establishing knowledge, respect, and validation for different cultures. You must first affirm the value and legitimacy of different group identities.
And then you integrate the best part of the other ideology.
Exactly. Step 2 is to incorporate the equality orientation aspect of colorblindness. This highlights group similarities, shared values, and common humanity, ensuring the focus doesn't become stuck solely on differences. This is the integration of we are different and that is good with but we are also fundamentally alike.
And the final step moves beyond just looking at differences or similarities.
The final step is to underscore the interconnections and mutual influences among cultures. This acknowledges that cultures are not static, isolated islands, but dynamic entities that constantly borrow from and enrich each other. This moves us toward a dual identity framework on a societal scale, where difference is respected, similarity is valued, and mutual influence is recognized.
This philosophical blend, respecting difference while demanding common equality, is what must inform policy at the highest level. Let's shift our attention now to how organizations and institutions translate these goals into concrete, systemic initiatives.
The goals are generally consistent across the board: decreasing achievement gaps between groups, increasing representation and inclusion, and fostering a climate that all stakeholders perceive as accepting, fair, and welcoming.
The sources group the actual practices into three major buckets. First, the resource practices.
These are focused on increasing support and opportunities for underrepresented groups. This means actively evaluating internal data to pinpoint where inequities exist, who is underrepresented in salary levels, who is excluded from promotion pipelines. It also means actively dedicating resources to ensure a diverse applicant pool and providing necessary mentoring or sponsorship opportunities.
Second, we have accountability practices. This is where the organization applies the institutional support principle we saw in Allport's model.
Accountability is about increasing responsibility and monitoring diversity objectives. It requires the organization to clearly signal that diversity is a core, valued, and normative priority, not just a side project. Managers must be held accountable for meeting specific goals related to representation and inclusion. Without clear metrics and consequences, these goals are easily deprioritized.
And the third category is non-discrimination practices, often implemented through training.
These are the policies designed specifically to decrease bias and discrimination in day-to-day operations, from hiring algorithms to internal review processes, and ensuring a clear, effective mechanism for addressing bias and harassment when it occurs.
A major systemic practice, and one that is intensely politically charged, is affirmative action, or AA.
Yeah.
The sources define AA as programs designed to combat discrimination and ensure equal opportunity in employment and education.
It's crucial to state up front that AA's primary goal is not to reduce prejudice directly. It's about correcting historical and systemic imbalances to create a diverse workforce or student body. It focuses on equitable outcomes, not necessarily attitude change.
However, the psychological effects on intergroup relations are complex and decidedly mixed. Let's look at the negative side first.
In-group members, often majority groups, may develop strong negative attitudes toward the beneficiaries of affirmative action. They perceive that a position was achieved not based on merit, but on group membership, which leads to resentment and can generalize to the entire outgroup. This fuels claims of reverse discrimination. And this is a significant challenge because it actively undermines the goals of positive intergroup relations.
I have to ask, if AA causes significant resentment and can actively worsen attitudes among some in-group members, doesn't that fundamentally defeat the purpose of improving intergroup relationships within the organization?
That's a powerful and necessary challenge. On an individual short-term basis, yes, the backlash is real and counterproductive to attitude change. However, if we look at the larger organizational perspective, the research shows that organizations that utilize AA often have more positive overall intergroup attitudes in the long run.
Why the contradiction?
Because AA successfully creates the diverse environment that then allows Allport's contact conditions, acquaintance potential, and equal status to flourish naturally. Even if individuals initially resent the program, they are exposed to increased, sustained positive contact with high-status outgroup members, which gradually dismantles stereotypes and reduces anxiety.
I see.
The policy may cause short-term resistance, but it creates the structural conditions necessary for long-term psychological change.
Diversity training is ubiquitous in institutions today, but the sources note enormous variability in content, from quick online modules to intensive multi-day workshops, making it very hard to generalize about its effectiveness.
And we face significant participation challenges. Mandatory training does not always translate to improved attitudes. Often, it just generates compliance without internal commitment and can, in fact, provoke resistance.
Conversely, voluntary training often attracts only those who already agree with the goals, the people who need it least, leading to low attendance among the target audience. The environment matters as much as the content.
We can categorize these programs broadly. Organizational programs are focused on observable behavior, ensuring fair hiring, equitable promotion practices, and addressing things like mentoring disparities on the job. These are focused on outcomes.
And educational programs are focused on cognitive and effective change, raising awareness of implicit biases, increasing understanding of how bias impacts underrepresented groups, and fostering empathy. These are focused on process and understanding.
A focused approach that shows promise is bias literacy training. This training aims to improve an individual's ability to detect their own prejudices and the biases operating in others' statements, transforming passive receivers into active detectors.
This training also explicitly equips people with confrontation strategies, which is a key behavioral skill for creating an inclusive environment.
They teach people to confront bias effectively by avoiding what the sources call the HATE avoidance rule, avoiding hostility, aggressiveness, threat, and extremity. The goal is to correct the behavior or statement without triggering the defensive backlash that intense negative effect often causes.
So instead of accusing someone of being racist, they are trained to use specific de-escalating tactics.
Exactly. For example, a trained individual might use a gentle inquiry, are you saying, to force the speaker to clarify their potentially biased statement. Or they might use a direct but evidence-based challenge. Actually, evidence shows that trend is happening because of X, Y, and Z, not because of what you suggested.
Or just express surprise.
Or simply expressing non-judgmental surprise. Do you really think that? which forces the speaker to pause and self-reflect. These tactics turn confrontation into a shared learning opportunity, maximizing the chances of triggering self-regulation in the other person.
We've seen that many of these systemic initiatives are double-edged swords. Let's summarize the key unintended consequences that organizations must guard against.
The first major issue relates to perceptions of fairness. Diversity initiatives can often signal that underrepresented groups have an unfair advantage, particularly when quotas or explicit set-asides are used. This, as we saw with affirmative action, directly leads to resentment and counterclaims of unfair treatment from majority members.
And this feeds into the second consequence, the signal of implied deficiency.
This is subtle but damaging. Initiatives may imply that members of underrepresented groups cannot succeed on their own merit and require assistance to achieve parity. This undermines the perceived competence and achievement of the beneficiaries, making the success feel hollow or illegitimate both to themselves and to others.
Finally, let's revisit the specific anxiety related to diversity training itself.
Even well-designed training can cause anxiety for participants, particularly majority members. They worry that colleagues might perceive them as prejudiced during the session, or they feel immense external pressure to change their deeply held attitudes immediately. This perceived pressure creates psychological reactance, a need to push back and resist the information leading to non-engagement. Training leaders must find ways to reduce this defensive reaction and emphasize that the goal is self-discovery and skill building, not accusation.
We've covered the structure of the theory. Now let's bring it full circle for you, the listener, and discuss the actionable steps you can take starting right now. It all begins with the internal work.
The first and perhaps hardest step is constant, brutal self-reflection. You must actively reflect on your own thoughts and behavior, understanding your complex identities, and, critically, acknowledging your prejudices. If you deny having them, the self-regulation cycle can never begin. You have to find your own personal cognitive breaches.
And once that internal engine of self-regulation is running, the next step is active, applied contact theory in your daily life.
You need to put the principles into practice. This means seeking out and attending multicultural events in your community, actively choosing settings where the opportunity for positive, low-stakes intergroup interaction is high.
And expanding on the indirect contact strategies.
Absolutely. Consume media that broadens your perspective. Read books, watch movies, and follow news sources that center on life experiences outside your immediate in-group. This is the application of extended and media contact theory to systematically introduce positive counter-stereotypes into your cognitive landscape. You are actively building those new, nuanced associations.
Once you've mastered the inner game, the next challenge is influencing the people around you, your friends, family, and colleagues. How do we help others move through this journey?
We guide them through the same process we went through. Help people become aware of their own attitudes and behavior. Gently point out the moments where their behavior contradicts their stated egalitarian self-image, triggering that necessary negative affect and reflection.
And when encouraging contact, we need to be strategic about it, right? We can't just tell them to meet new people.
No. Encourage intergroup contact, but ensure you are working to set up the successful conditions outlined by Allport. Emphasize a shared goal or cooperation, structure the interaction so they meet as equals, and maximize the chance that they will find common ground and develop a genuine acquaintance.
We must also combat ignorance that fuels prejudice.
Help others become better informed. Use the factual data and the insights we discussed today to dispel the myths and misrepresentations that underpin negative stereotypes. This requires patience, but knowledge is a powerful antidote to bias.
And finally, the simplest but perhaps most essential role. Be a model.
Be a positive role model. Demonstrate non-prejudiced behavior consistently in your own life and interactions, especially for younger people who are still developing their social frameworks. Your sustained, positive behavior acts as a constant, low-anxiety form of extended contact for everyone who observes you.
This deep dive has shown us the immense effort required from the individual's mental gymnastics of self-regulation and perspective-taking to the structured architecture needed for successful intergroup contact, and finally, the complicated landscape of systemic ideologies and organizational policies. We've learned that the most effective strategies combine respect for difference with an unwavering focus on common humanity.
The key synthesis of this research is that reducing prejudice is fundamentally a multi-level active process. Intention is insufficient. You need conscious practice, systematic exposure to positive counter-stereotypes, and structural support that facilitates successful positive contact. The difficulty, as we discussed with the common in-group identity model, lies in finding that balance retaining valued, unique identities while committing to a higher-order common goal. That tension is where true social change resides.
And the high stakes are confirmed by that chilling finding. The positive-negative contact asymmetry, where one painful experience can wipe out the progress of several good ones.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought, one that ties the individual effort to the institutional mandate. If we know that negative contact is more profoundly powerful than positive contact, doesn't that make the role of institutional support, all ports condition number 4, far more critical than we first realized? Institutional authorities are the only actors large enough to minimize the chances of that harmful single-instance negative interaction through clear policies, sanctions, and anti-discrimination mandates. Protecting the psychological environment is essential to safeguarding the entire effort to build intergroup understanding. That institutional responsibility, mitigating the risk of powerful negative contact, is something worth exploring further, perhaps even dedicating resources specifically to failure avoidance, rather than just success seeking.
A deeply compelling challenge to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the psychology of reducing prejudice and discrimination.